The worst kind of humiliation, I have always believed, is the graceful kind. The sort where the room knows precisely what has happened, where every polished face holds its expression just so, and where you must sit very still and pretend that you have not understood a word of it. I have been keeping this story for some time, my dear friends. It came to me in pieces, the way the best ones always do, a detail here, a letter there, and finally, one February evening, the whole of it set down in a hand so careful it was clear the writer had lived it exactly as described. I do not often share stories of this particular kind, but I think you will understand, before we are through, why this one refused to be kept. It begins at Hartmore Hall, Northumberland, in the December of 1818. You must picture it as it was. The stone cold in that particular northern way that makes the fires inside seem not merely warm but necessary, the grounds grey-brown under frost, and the great house lit in every window against the early dark, like something that has decided to argue with the season. Miss Winifred Stanhope arrived on a Tuesday noon, which is never the most auspicious day for a beginner gent. She was 27 years old, the eldest daughter of Mr. Herbert Stanhope of Halifax, a man who had built his fortune in printing and publishing, who knew the value of a well-turned sentence, and who had sent his daughter north with the careful hope of a father and arrived at a reasonable conclusion. Warren Kenton, Dean of the Fin. The conclusion was this: Mr. Arthur Carver, younger brother of Roland Carver, the Earl of Hartmore, was a man of good family, agreeable manners, and sufficient income. The families had corresponded. An arrangement had been proposed. Miss Stanhope's visit of a fortnight was understood to be the opportunity for both parties to confirm what the correspondence had suggested. I want you to remember, my dear friends, that Miss Stanhope had entered this understanding with her eyes open. She was not a woman of illusions. Her father had raised her on books and honest conversation, and she knew perfectly well that arrangements of this kind were not guarantees. They were, at best, opportunities. By the third day, she had assessed the opportunity with characteristic precision and arrived at an inconvenient conclusion. Mr. Arthur Carver was charming. He was pleasant and easy in company, with the sort of warmth that fills a room without requiring anything particular from it. He asked after her journey. He inquired about her father's work with genuine interest. He was, in every visible respect, exactly what had been described. He was also, with a consistency that could not be mistaken, watching Miss Penelope Grosvenor. Miss Grosvenor was the daughter of the neighbouring estate's family. She was present at Hartmore Hall with the frequency of someone who had long since ceased to be a guest and become a fixture. She was pretty and kind and quietly, carefully miserable in the particular way of a woman who is watching the man she loves be steered towards someone else and cannot say so without causing a pain she does not intend. Miss Stanhope recognized it immediately because she had always been a careful reader, and unhappiness of that particular kind is not difficult to read if one is paying attention. She was paying attention. At the head of the table each evening sat Roland Carver, Earl of Hartmore. He was 38 years old, dark-haired, and almost entirely silent, not the silence of a man with nothing to say. I want you to understand the distinction, my dear friends, because it matters enormously here, but the silence of a man who has assessed what's speaking and frequently found the answer insufficient. He observed everything. He said very little. The neighbouring families appeared to find it unnerving. Miss Stanhope found it privately something close to relief. There is a particular exhaustion you see in rooms that require constant performance. She had been performing, in one register or another, since the carriage had pulled into the Hartmore drive. The Earl required nothing of her. He simply watched, with the steady, unhurried attention of a man who is genuinely curious and has the patience to wait for understanding. It was on the 5th evening that the thing happened. The Grosvenors had come to supper, and with them a Mr. Lindstrom, a county gentleman of comfortable standing and comfortable assumptions, the sort of man who considers himself broadly tolerant and proves reliably that he is not. He said something, not quite to Miss Stanhope, and not quite away from her, in the particular register calculated to be heard by the table without being addressed to anyone in particular, about the difficulty of certain connections, about how families in trade, however successful, must find it something of a challenge to understand the responsibilities of an estate of this kind. He said it pleasantly. He looked nowhere in particular. He took a sip of his claret. The table's attention moved in that collective, invisible way. The slight shift, the careful stillness, the practiced courtesy of people who know an unkindness has been offered and are deciding whether to acknowledge it. Miss Stanhope looked at the candelabra. She had spent 27 years developing the capacity to receive this particular category of remark with an expression that gave nothing away. She was very good at it. The Earl set down his fork. It was a small sound, the kind of small sound that arrives in a room and makes itself known precisely because the person making it has decided it will be known. Mr. Lindstrom. His voice was very quiet. In 5 evenings she had not heard him address a full sentence to anyone at table. Miss Stanhope's father built one of the most respected publishing houses in the Atlantic provinces. She has read more about the management of an estate like this one than most men who stand to inherit one. I would suggest we speak of something worth speaking of. Not a rebuke, not quite. More like a door, closed with absolute precision, by a man who has decided the conversation is finished and sees no reason to make an event of that decision. The room went still in a different way than before. Mr. Lindstrom's smile thinned. Lady Carver at the foot of the table looked at her elder son with an expression that contained several things at once, none of them displeasure. Miss Grosvenor examined her soup. Mr. Arthur Carver looked at the ceiling with the expression of a younger brother who is both grateful and slightly awed. Miss Stanhope looked at the candelabra. She did not look at the Earl, she did not trust herself to look at the Earl with an expression that would not reveal something she had not yet had the time to examine. What she felt in that moment was not gratitude of the simple kind. It was something quieter and more disorienting, the specific sensation of being defeated by someone who required nothing in return for the defense, no performance of appreciation, no acknowledgement, no social transaction. Simply the judgment that a thing had gone far enough, and the action that followed from that judgment. She had not been prepared for it. I do not think she had been prepared for very much about Hartmore Hall. The music room became her sanctuary on the 7th day. It was a room at the back of the east wing that had apparently not been used for any consistent purpose in some years. A pianoforte, a clavichord, several music stands, a long table covered in loose papers. She found it by accident, following a draughty corridor that ended where she had not expected it to end, and she found it empty, which in a house full of careful social performance was as close to heaven as the circumstances permitted. She had brought in her travelling trunk a manuscript, an old one, given to her by her father, a collection of letters from an 18th-century naturalist that his publishing house was considering. It required translation from French in several passages, and she had been meaning to work through it since before the journey north. The music room had a good window, a passable writing table, and the considerable advantage of being entirely unoccupied. She set up her papers and her inkwell and her small notebook and began to work. The Earl found her there on the 9th day. She had not heard him come in. She had been deep in a particularly difficult passage. The naturalist had a habit of switching mid-sentence into a regional French dialect that was giving her considerable trouble. And when she looked up, he was already at the far end of the room, examining a shelf of old music folios, with the focused attention of a man who is genuinely interested in what he is looking at. She had expected him to acknowledge her presence, to say something about finding her there, or to excuse himself. He did neither. He took the folio he had apparently come for, moved to the table at the far end of the room, sat down and opened it. He did not speak. He did not look at her again. He simply settled into the room, with the quality of a man who has been in this room before and expects to remain in it comfortably. After a moment, Miss Stanhope looked back at the manuscript. They remained in the music room together for 2 hours. She worked through 4 pages of French. He worked through whatever was in the folio. When the clock on the mantelpiece indicated the hour for dressing, they both looked up at the same moment. "Thank you for not insisting I leave," she said, because she had decided to say it. He looked at her with the direct attention she was becoming, she realized, accustomed to. "It is your room as much as mine," he said. "I first found it empty by perhaps 2 decades. But you were here before I arrived today." She thought about those words, and the precise way they were delivered for the remainder of the evening. The morning after the county Christmastide assembly, at which Mr. Arthur Carver had danced twice with Miss Grosvenor and once with Miss Stanhope in an order that communicated everything necessary, Arthur came to find her on the morning room terrace. She was reviewing her notebook, because she found clear thinking difficult indoors when there was something to resolve. "Miss Stanhope," he had said. He had the expression of a man who has rehearsed an apology and is not certain he has rehearsed it enough. "I owe you an honest conversation." "Yes," she said. "Sit down, Mr. Carver." He sat. He was, she thought, a genuinely decent person, the kind of person who has never been required to be more than pleasant, and who is therefore somewhat overwhelmed by the moments when pleasantness is not adequate. "I was not attentive at the assembly," he said. "I was not." He stopped, started differently. "I should tell you something." "I know about Miss Grosvenor," she said. The silence that followed was the silence of a secret that has not been one. "You knew," he said. "I noticed," she said, which is not the same thing. She set the notebook on her knee and looked at him steadily. "Mr. Carver, do you wish to marry me?" He looked at the stone railing. He looked at his hands. He looked at her, finally, with the expression of a man who has been offered the mercy of honesty and is not yet certain he deserves it. "No," he said quietly, with the relief of a man setting down something he was never meant to carry. "Thank you," she said. He blinked. "That is your response." "It is the correct answer to a direct question," she said. "I prefer it to another week of a situation that serves neither of us." She paused. "You should speak to your mother, and you should tell Miss Grosvenor whatever she deserves to be told, which I suspect is rather more than she currently knows." He looked at her with an expression she might, in other circumstances, have called admiration. "You are remarkably composed," he said. "I have had a week," she said. "You have had 1 night." He left. She sat on the terrace and looked at the frost-stiff garden and thought, with the clear-eyed honesty she had always maintained with herself, about the arrangement and what it meant that it was dissolving, and what she would say to her father. And she thought about the music room. She was in the music room that same afternoon when the Earl came in. She had been trying to concentrate on the manuscript. She had not been succeeding. She was aware, in the particular way of a person who has spent a fortnight noticing someone they had not expected to notice, that things were happening in other parts of the house. Conversations, decisions, the quiet machinery of arrangements being remade. She could not have said exactly what was being decided. She could have said, with some precision, that she was sitting very still and thinking about a man at the other end of a room who had told Mr. Lindstrom that she had read more about estate management than most men, who stood to inherit one. The door opened. The Earl came in. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped in the process of reaching for her pen. They looked at each other across the length of the room. "Sit down," he said, "if you like." And then, after a brief pause, "You do not have to speak." She sat down. He came in and went to his table. His table, she had begun to think of it, in the way that spaces become associated with the people who occupy them with consistency, and opened the folio. He did not look at her again. She looked at the manuscript, she looked at the Earl, she looked at the window, where the December light was going pale and golden across the Northumberland hills. She opened the manuscript. They were in the music room for 2 hours and 10 minutes. She translated approximately 3 pages, which was fewer than her usual rate, because her attention was not entirely on the naturalist's letters. When the mantelpiece clock struck 5, they both looked up. "I should go and dress," she said. "Yes," he said. She rose. She gathered her papers. She stopped at the door, because she had decided to say something and had no intention of leaving without saying it. "My lord," she said. "Miss Stanhope," he said. "At the supper," she said. "What you said to Mr. Lindstrom." She found the right form. "I want you to know that I understood it as it was meant." He looked at her across the room. He had very direct eyes, dark, she had observed early, the kind of dark that was not blankness but depth. Considerable depth, if one was paying attention. "How was it meant?" he said. "As your actual opinion," she said, "not as a performance of courtesy." He held her gaze for a moment. "It was," he said. She nodded once. She turned to go. She stopped one more time, and here, my dear friends, I confess this is the detail I find most characteristic of her and most worth carrying forward, because she had one more thing to say and had decided honesty was the only register worth using. "The naturalist manuscript I have been working on," she said, "is a collection of correspondence from the 1740s. There are 2 letters that appear to document an historical agreement about land near this estate, Hartmore land, from what I can tell, based on the place names. I do not know if it is relevant to current matters, but I thought you should be aware of it." She left. Behind her, she heard the Earl set down his pen. Her father arrived on the Thursday. He came in his travelling coat with the expression of a man who has read a letter and made a 3-day journey, because reading a letter is not the same as understanding a situation. And Mr. Herbert Stanhope had always understood the difference between information and knowledge. He embraced her in the entrance hall with the warmth of a man who is relieved without quite knowing what he had been afraid of. She felt in that embrace the specific comfort of being known correctly by someone who has always known her correctly. "Tell me," he said. She told him, Arthur and Miss Grosvenor, the assembly, the music room. She did not tell him about the supper and Mr. Lindstrom because she was not ready, or perhaps because she already knew, with a clarity she was still becoming accustomed to, that she would not need to. He listened. He asked 2 questions. Both were excellent questions. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You are not unhappy," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am clarified," she said, and it was exactly the right word. He looked at her with the expression she loved best on him. The expression of a man being surprised by his own daughter in a direction he entirely approves of. "The Earl," he said, "has asked to speak with me." "I know," she said. "What does he wish to speak to me about?" She met her father's eyes with the steady, direct gaze of a woman who has spent a fortnight in a house noticing things and who has arrived, somewhere in the music room, in 2 hours and 10 minutes of shared silence, at a certainty she had not been looking for and does not intend to explain away. "I think," she said, "you should hear it from him. I will not tell you the whole of what passed between the Earl and her father, my dear friends. Partly because some conversations belong to the people who have them, and lose something in the retelling. What I can tell you is that Mr. Herbert Stanhope asked 4 questions, and that every one of them was, by the Earl's own account, exactly the right question. She was in the music room. Naturally, she was in the music room. She had the naturalist's letters and a good fire, and the knowledge that something was happening 2 corridors away, that was either the beginning of something or the confirmation of something, and that in either case she had done what she could, and the rest was not hers to manage. She read, the fire settled, the December dark came early. The door opened at 5:30. The Earl came in. He did not go to his table. He came to the fire, closer than he had come in any of their shared hours, and stood with his hands behind his back and looked at the flames for a moment, and then at her. "Your father," he said, "is an exceptionally direct man." "Yes," she said. "He asked me 4 questions." A pause. All of them were the right questions. "What did you tell him?" He looked at her. The fire made the room warm and the room was very still. "I told him," he said. "And here, my dear friends, I want you to listen, because this is the part of the story I have been keeping for you. I told him that I have spent a fortnight in the company of a woman who translates 18th century French naturalist correspondence for the pleasure of understanding it, who finds a draughty back room and turns it into the most purposeful space in the house, and who said to a room full of carefully maintained social surfaces, at the end of a conversation about old land documents, 'I thought you should be aware of it.' As though the most natural thing in the world were to hand a person useful information and walk out the door." He paused. "I told him that I have known what I wanted since the 9th of December, when you told me the music room was mine as much as yours, and went back to your manuscript as though it were a settled matter." Another pause. "I am not accustomed to things feeling settled. I found it remarkable." Miss Stanhope looked at the fire. She looked at the naturalist's letters. She looked at Roland Carver, Earl of Hartmore, who had spoken into a supper table with the quiet force of a man who has decided something and does not require an audience for his decisions, and who had given her a room and silence and the particular dignity of not being managed. She thought about what it was to be seen correctly, not assessed, not arranged, not improved into something more convenient. Seen as what she was, a merchant's daughter, a translator, a woman who reads estate histories and finds things in old letters and says so plainly, and found not merely acceptable, found in some precise and unperformed way, exactly right. "I have conditions," she said. The Earl's expression changed. Not a smile, precisely, but the quality of a man who has been surprised in a direction he finds entirely appropriate to the situation. "I would think considerably less of you if you did not," he said. "I will not be managed," she said. "If you have a view, I want it said directly. If you have a concern, I want to hear it. I do not respond well to being handled." She held his gaze. "And the naturalist letters, if there is genuinely a historical agreement about Hartmore land in those pages, it must be properly examined. Not set aside because it is inconvenient." "Agreed," he said without hesitation, "on both counts." She looked at him. He looked at her. "Miss Stanhope," he said, and then, with the quiet acknowledgement of 2 people who have arrived somewhere, that formal address no longer quite fits, "Winifred." It was the first time he had used her given name. It was delivered with the same unhurried precision as everything else about him, not a performance, simply the recognition that something had shifted and he was not going to pretend otherwise. "I love you. I have been aware of it since the 9th of December, and have not said so because I was not certain it was the right moment. I am now certain there is no such thing as the right moment in this room. This room simply rewards directness." "It does," she agreed. "Yes," she said. "The answer to what you were going to ask is yes." He crossed the room. He sat in the chair beside her. Not at his table, not at a formal distance, but beside her, by the fire, in the chair nearest to where she was, with the ease of a man who has been, in some essential way, moving toward this particular chair for a fortnight without knowing it was where he was headed. She showed him the letters. He read them with complete and genuine attention and said she was very likely right about the land agreement and that his solicitor in Newcastle would need to see the originals without delay. "You found this in a fortnight," he said, "when I have owned this estate for 12 years. "I was looking," she said. "I know," he said. "That is precisely the thing. If you will allow me a moment, my dear friends, and I know you will, I want to tell you that the county talked." Of course it did. There was considerable conversation about the arrangement with the Stanhope girl that had dissolved, about young Miss Arthur Carver and Miss Grosvenor, who married in February in a ceremony that was small and evidently very happy, and about the Earl of Hartmore and the Halifax publisher's daughter, and what on earth it all signified. The county had opinions. The county's opinions were, as usual, beside the point. Mr. Herbert Stanhope came to Hartmore Hall for the engagement announcement and sat across the dinner table from Lady Carver. The Earl's mother, a woman who had spent 30 years managing every social surface available to her, and who was, Winifred had come to discover, far more interesting than any of those surfaces had suggested. Miss Stanhope and Lady Carver talked about publishing, and about Northumberland's history, and about the proper management of a house that has been in a family long enough to develop opinions of its own, and the conversation lasted through the fish course and the removes, and showed no sign of concluding. Winifred watched her father talk to Lady Carver across the candlelit table, and thought, that is the match no one arranged, and perhaps the better for it. She said as much to the Earl in the carriage on the way home, in the dark. He was quiet for a moment. Your father asked me, he said, whether I was the kind of man who would still be paying attention in 20 years, not merely in the first season, in all the seasons after. What did you say? I said I had been paying attention since the 9th of December, he said, and that I did not anticipate the habit changing. She held his hand in the dark of the carriage. He held it back with the certain quiet grip of a man who has found what he was looking for and intends to be careful with it. Outside, the Northumberland countryside moved past in the dark, and inside the carriage 2 people sat in the particular silence that is not absence, but completion. They were married in March, in the chapel at Hartmore Hall, in the sensible and unhurried way of 2 people who had already agreed on everything that mattered, and did not require an elaborate occasion to confirm it. Mr. Arthur Carver attended with Miss Grosvenor, now Mrs. Carver, who was visibly and thoroughly happy, which was the finest version of him Winifred had seen, and which she was genuinely glad of. Mr. Herbert Stanhope stood beside Lady Carver during the ceremony. They appeared to be conducting a low-voiced conversation about the Newcastle solicitor's findings regarding the naturalist's letters, which had proven rather more significant than anyone had anticipated. It was, Winifred thought, extremely characteristic of both of them, and she was not troubled by it in the least. The historical land agreement, properly examined, resolved a boundary dispute the estate had carried unresolved for 60 years. The Earl's solicitor was gratifyingly astonished. The Earl was not astonished at all. He had, by that point, entirely recalibrated his expectations of what his wife was likely to find when she was looking at something. At the wedding breakfast, Winifred was showing the Earl her revised notes on the matter. She had made additions since the solicitor's letter, when his secretary, a patient man of long observation named Mr. Fallow, said quietly to the housekeeper, Mrs. Holt, that he had known since the morning of the music room how this was going to go. Mrs. Holt, who had been at Hartmore Hall for 22 years, said she had known since the supper, since the moment the Earl set down his fork. His lordship, she said, does not speak for anything he is not entirely certain of. No, said Mr. Fallow, he does not. Across the breakfast table, the Earl set down Winifred's notes, looked at her, and said that the western portion of the boundary question was still not fully resolved, and would require a second survey. I know, she said, I have notes on the western portion as well. I thought you might, he said. And perhaps that is why I have kept this story as long as I have, my dear friends. Not because an arrangement dissolved, or a pleasant man found the courage to be honest, or a county dinner was interrupted by a man who decided something had gone far enough, and said so, but because 2 people who had each, in their separate and solitary ways, been misread by the world, she for her birth, he for his silence, found each other in a back room of a northern house in December, and discovered that what the world had taken for deficiency was in both cases precision. And that precision, given enough time and enough quiet, and one good draughty room, tends to recognize itself. she was brought north for the charming brother. She found the right man in the music room. Not despite the manuscript and the cold corridor and the words spoken into a supper table, my dear friends. Because of all of it. Because the person who defends you without requiring your gratitude, who shares your space without demanding your performance, who says the true thing once and means it with his entire unperforming self, that person is the rarest kind. And the unmistakable air of a woman. You do not let the county's opinion of the arrangement determine what you do about it. If this is the first time you have found your way to Moonlight at Bellwood, I am very glad you are here. Subscribe, if you are so inclined. There are more stories waiting by this fire, and I keep every one of them until I am certain it has earned the telling. Come back for the next one. The fire is warm, the night is long, and we are only beginning.